Hi, and welcome to this Creative Climate Chat with Julie's Bicycle. I'm Farah Ahmed, and today we are joined by Chaitanya Kumar from the New Economics Foundation. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. So the conversation today will be recorded, so your microphone and video has been turned off. Please use the Q&A function for any questions you have, and we might call on you to ask your question personally if we have time. If you have any technical difficulties, please use chat and select all panelists, and we'll try and respond. Our colleague Ruby is available to do that. Stop sharing. Please join the conversation on your preferred social media channel using the hashtag Creative Climate Chat. Please tag Julie's Bicycle, Chaitanya Kumar, and the New Economics Foundation. And finally, we are fully booked and live streaming today's session. So we've shared the link in the chat with you. So please feel free to share with others to join in the conversation on social media and elsewhere. So I'm going to hand over to Alison Tickell, who's the director of Julie's Bicycle, and then we'll get into the conversation with Chaitanya.
Thank you, Farah. First of all, hello and welcome to the second of our Creative Climate Chats. It's terrific to have you all here. And as Farah said, we do have a full house. So there's such an exciting momentum and interest. A quick introduction from me. These conversations are great moments for us to meet exceptional people from the climate and culture movement doing quite exceptional things to change the world for the better. The landscape, as we all know, really does need some tending. Our several crises right now include health and social care, the economic crisis, rising poverty, the erosion of democracy, a persistent and obstinate failure to get to grips with social mobility. As we saw today, the UK's rating is down once again, one of the lowest in Europe. And of course, this incredibly painful systemic racism that has been exposed so shockingly since May the 25th. And the other beast in the room is, of course, the climate and the environmental crisis, which has such severe consequences for frontline communities and even more perilous ones on the horizon. As I said last week, for those of you who've heard this before, apologies, but these crises are closely bound together. Extractive growth to benefit a small number of economies and people at horrific human and environmental cost. And this same outdated version of the world, extract to grow, also constrains our capacity to respond to these really critical moments. A radically new approach is necessary to reverse this destructive trend, and I think we all feel that. Culture, deeply part of this. If we continue to value our work through tickets or products sold, it's as broken as the rest of it. An endlessly insatiable model of more and more and more, and this is truly challenging. We need a new cultural contract which serves the larger purpose. And of course, there is a once in a generation opportunity now to create a new model of prosperity. At the heart of this is the convergence of three imperatives, which we'll be talking about today: net zero emissions, a Green Deal framework, and the so-called just transition. This last requiring a full frontal look at climate injustice, past and present, and ways that we need to deal with it. This rewiring goes so much deeper than the cabling needed for zero carbon. This means rewiring our social fabric, our history, our sense of who we might be, and a really rapid engagement. This is the challenge of the just transition, climate action that generates positive social impact. So last week we had the inspirational Lucy Davis from the Royal Court talking about how she put her climate convictions into practice in her theatre, how the approach combined collective and empowering teamwork with a focus on the science, from net zero right through to commissioning, a company embodying the change that we need to see. Lucy spoke about her own liberation when she came on JB's Creative Climate Leadership course and realized that she didn't need to be an expert to take ambitious and enthusiastic action on climate. We do have the opposite today. Not that Lucy isn't an expert, she's an expert in so many things, including climate action, but we do have an extraordinary expert today with Chaitanya Kumar, who some of you might remember from the We Make Tomorrow event that we ran in February 100 years ago. And if you would like to see that again, we've got it on the live stream. Chaitanya recently became head of environment and green transition at the New Economics Foundation, which itself is an incredibly inspiring organization. And that was after 3 years as head of energy and climate policy at the Green Alliance. In his previous life, he was a campaigner against coal covering South Asia with 350.org. And before that, he trained young people in India on the science and solutions to climate change. He's closely followed both domestic and international political movements on climate change and writes regularly on this matter with commentary in The Guardian, the HuffPost, ABC, and other publications. But what makes Chaitanya so inspiring is his depth of expertise and experience across the whole climate landscape, from renewable energy policy to frontline justice. He really understands deeply the intersectionality of this issue and all the bits that really need to make it work. So Chaitanya, you are so welcome. We're so happy to have you with us today. And I'm just going to kick off with asking you what brought you to this space today.
Thank you so much, Alison. I hope you and others on this call can hear me all right. It's a fantastic introduction, and of course I've done a lot of those, but there are several other experts, and I certainly don't hold myself as one, but I have been looking and trying to learn and understand this issue over the last 12 years and counting. So if experience counts, then yes, I can speak to that. My journey, as I mentioned, started about 12, 13 years ago, just out of college, back in India. I come from a city called Hyderabad in southern India, a city the size of London, roughly, about 9 million people, which just hit one of its highest temperatures, by the way, for May, which is about 47 degrees Celsius. Another indication of how climate change impacts some of the countries in the global south. And funny enough, my introduction to the climate space was through cinema and documentaries. I used to watch a lot of them, particularly around a concept called peak oil, which has now unfortunately been a debunked theory, but nonetheless, it really piqued my interest when it comes to energy and climate issues. The peak oil concept was basically suggesting that we would essentially run out of oil, and that would create a lot of havoc given the entire global economy pretty much runs on fossil fuels, oil and gas. But that led me to Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. That was way back in 2007. And that sort of began my journey around climate as well. I led one of the youth delegations from India to the United Nations Climate Conference, which is an annual event. And back when I first went, it was back in 2008 in Poland, one of the countries that relies a lot on coal in Europe, for instance. And that's where I met a lot of young people back then of my age who had this incredible passion for climate and really being able to sort of empathize with people that they've never met in the global south, in the low-lying island nations, in the least developed countries. And that really resonated with me as well, that here's a community of people that clearly deeply care for this issue. And that really left a deep imprint in my heart. And I've since then not looked back and made this my life's passion as well. So I've been working on climate for 12 years, as I said, and I've moved to the UK 2015, 2016, and have been working in the space since then as well. Alison has spoken already about everything else I've done while I was here. I can unpack that and speak more about policy and regulation and technology and other bits. Green New Deal, as you mentioned, Alison, happy to chat about that. But yeah, that's how I began my journey.
Thanks, Chaitanya. I didn't realize that you had been here, you'd only arrived here 2015, 16. You've packed in quite a punch since that time. So one of your campaigns at the New Economics Foundation is the green transition, the Green New Deal. Can you tell us a bit about it, what it is, and where you particularly, where New Economics Foundation is up to with it?
It is a very, very exciting notion, an idea, and a lot of people have come across this phrase these days, thanks to the media, and AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez in the US, sort of popularized this phrase. But the roots of it actually are in the UK, funny enough, with the organization I work with at the moment, the New Economics Foundation. And the idea emerged on the back of the financial crash of 2007-8. And the goal for NEF and a lot of people like Anne Pettifor, who some of you listening in would know, who led the Jubilee Debt campaign a couple of decades ago. And they saw this again as an opportunity to rewire the economic system and transfer the public investment that was going in, this massive amounts of money of quantitative easing, as we called it, into the economy, but redirecting it towards the green infrastructure that we so desperately needed, and we still do. So that's when the roots of Green New Deal began. And the term New Deal itself goes back to America. And just after the Depression of 29-30, Franklin D. Roosevelt basically introduced the concept of the New Deal, which is basically massive investment into roads, public infrastructure, bridges, things like that, and really kickstart the economy and provide the jobs that people needed. So bring the New Deal, bring the green bits, merge them together, you get the Green New Deal. The 21st century variation or twist to this, I suppose, is we definitely have come leaps and bounds in terms of really understanding how our economy works. And we realize that it doesn't really work for everybody equally. It favors the wealthy even more, and it disenfranchises and disempowers the least well-off even more. So we've come to realize and acknowledge that stark inequality that exists, and the solution to climate change cannot be seen as in a silo, as separate or distinct to the problem of inequality, and both have to be merged together. And I think that's the sort of 21st century approach to the New Deal or the Green New Deal, that how do you get in the green infrastructure that we need as an economy, and merge it with how do you also deal with inequality and mitigate inequality as much as possible. And hence this new idea that NEF has been working on for a long time. And it feels like these are, as everyone acknowledges, unfortunate times that we're living through, but nonetheless, looking at some of the words that people have been putting forth as a response to COVID-19 as part of green recovery, there is a sense of optimism, there is a sense of opportunity here. And that's what NEF is here to do. We've been asking us, we were on the fringe of sort of lefty think tanks, as we used to be sort of discarded, but now suddenly those ideas are suddenly mainstream, if I could call it that. So in that sense, it's quite an exciting time. And the goal is, like I said, just to re-emphasize, marrying the climate solutions that we all know with the social and equity challenges that we face and bringing it together. That's the goal of the Green New Deal.
And I mean, you've already kind of alluded to it, but this idea that is so urgently being expressed at the moment around social justice is kind of, it underpins a lot of Green New Deal thinking, as is known as the just transition, which sits at the forefront of so much of your work, Chaitanya. What do you think we need to do to prompt, to cajole, to persuade, or to force the justice in a just transition to build and gather?
Yeah, perhaps let me just speak briefly to what just transition really means. I'll give you a specific example. So just this morning, in fact, NEF produced a report on the aviation sector. If you turn on the news of the last couple of months, you must have heard the likes of Richard Branson, likes of Michael O'Leary, people like that, who were the big bosses of the airline companies, basically asking for money, right? Public money and public bailouts. And forget the irony in everything that they've done over the last decade or two, and suddenly just asking for money. But there is a question that gets ignored, is what happens to the people working in these sectors? And are these companies and these bosses of these companies who are asking for this public support, how are they ensuring that the workers in this sector will be protected, right? So we produced a report talking about the aviation bailouts and how we can secure the jobs and the livelihoods of the aviation sector workers, essentially. Why am I talking about that without the mention of climate? Is simply because of this, that we can't, again, like I said earlier, dissociate the two. What we know is the aviation sector cannot continue in the unsustainable fashion that it has been. So demand for aviation has to go down. most numbers indicate that roughly 25% cut in demand is what we need from now to 2050. Doesn't seem a lot, but if you compare with the fact that the projections for the aviation sector now are 50% growth. So the current business as usual scenario is a 50% growth. What we need, in fact, is a 25% cut. So there is a wide disparity between where we headed and where we ought to go, right? And COVID-19 comes at an interesting situation where we're at a crossroads again with the aviation sector, where we have to protect these employees and workers who are clearly being impacted severely. At the same time, we have an opportunity to decarbonize the aviation sector and cut down demand. And if you try and merge that two together, the concept and the notion of just transition emerges, that we are forcing this transition onto a sector because they have to decarbonize and there will be a job loss situation. How do we mitigate two at the same time? So that's what the report gets into. And it applies to all sectors. If you look at the coal sector, the news yesterday has been that UK, for the first time in its history, has run 2 months straight, 60 days and 23 hours counting, without burning a single piece of coal, which is unprecedented. But that has also come at a lot of coal mines being shut, a lot of coal jobs being decimated, right? And the story of the transition in that sector hasn't been rosy. If you look at Thatcher eras and beyond that, the coal sector hasn't necessarily been supported as much. I'm not saying that means you keep bringing back coal and keep burning it, but the idea is how do you support the workers in that space? And that's where the just transition bit comes in aviation, in power sectors, in transport, in the automobile sector, in every sector that needs to decarbonize. There will unfortunately be a community of people who will be disenfranchised, and we need to sort of support them as we go along. That's the concept of just transition. That's what we're working on.
Yeah, terrific. And we will talk a little bit about a just transition within culture. But because one of the sort of angles on the just transition has been incredibly exposed by current events. Both COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter are really opening up the conversation about how deep must we go in the idea of justice and a transition that's going to take us away, not just about jobs, but actually looking at a more profound notion of what justice is and how it has been meted out or not in the past. To what extent we have problems in the cultural sector around who gets what job, who's entitled to what, all the same systemic issues that afflict wider society. To what extent do you think the environmental movement has been guilty of not acknowledging some of these realities?
I mean, to a good extent, to a culpable extent, I suppose. But my intention is not necessarily to sort of point fingers and say, look, the environment movement has failed. It has failed in some sense. It has succeeded in other ways, to be honest. But when you're looking at the intersectional aspects or intersectionality aspects of the environment movement in Britain or in the US or anywhere in the Western world, it hasn't been great. It's largely sort of middle class led, largely white dominated spaces and action, and that creates an environment where suddenly it's not really accessible to a lot of people that are actually more impacted by the crisis that we're facing, be it inequality or be it climate change. And I think, again, part of the Green New Deal and part of the 21st century thinking around the New Deal is merging these two issues together as well, and really understanding who are the communities that are being impacted, who are the people that are being impacted, how do we bring them in the conversations. Part of NEF's role, which I think, even though I've been at NEF only for a month, one thing I really admire and appreciate about NEF and a lot of other similar organizations is they really try and think about policy that is led and developed by people who are being impacted by the policy, or who we see will be impacted by the policy. And having worked,
Is this what you mean by this lovely phrase I've read in your work, intersectional policymaking?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the goal is, so again, I'll give you a very good example that my colleague Emily is doing. It's a fantastic project. It's understanding what are the structural barriers to accessing green spaces in the UK for Black and ethnic minority communities, right? The common and lazy refrain in the media that you talk about, culturally, they're just not interested in hiking. They're just not interested in green space. But that's rubbish. Like, it's human to have a natural affinity towards green spaces, nature and all of that. There are certain barriers that we have created that do not make it accessible. So that's a research question. And the way she's gone about undertaking that research is not sitting at the desk and working it out, is going out with peer review and peer research, where you peer research, sorry, where you basically find people in those communities and train them, provide them the resources to actually go down and interview their people, their community, and bring back the research. And that feeds into the policy and advocacy work that we do. And we're trying to do that across all our work areas and really understand, listen to the people who are being impacted by the policy that we want to bring about, and then translate that into a language that perhaps people sitting in Whitehall or Westminster will understand. And that's the notion of intersectional policymaking that NEF is keen on and needs to be done on climate as much as any other policy area.
And it sounds like it's a sort of an approach that many, particularly socially engaged arts and cultural organisations are very familiar with when they're, very place-based, very community-focused. Have you ever thought about ways that you might work with the cultural or the creative community in that sort of process of engagement?
Not directly. I'm still learning about the history and legacy of NEF and how they've engaged with the cultural community, but I'm certainly keen, if I can say that on this call. But in a slightly conceptual way, I suppose, one of the things that we're quickly realizing is, again, imagine 1990 for a lot of people, even if you're a millennial, I suppose, but 1990 is still just 30 years ago, right? And we know how the world has changed. But in the next 30 years, we have to have a complete transformation, reaching net zero, i.e. no net carbon emissions being put out into the atmosphere anywhere in Britain in the next 30 years is a Herculean task. In fact, we need to go faster than 2050. And that requires a scale of transformation that we have never imagined. And and the goal is to try and make sure that I've lost my train of thought now. It's your question. Do you mind just repeating that? Because there's so many aspects to that. But sorry.
It's simply that how you were describing some of the ways that you work is also very familiar in the
That's right.
creative sector. And there might, when we talk about intersectionality, often we talk about we really need to bust some of the silos between how we work, and I was just wondering if there were ways that NEF has engaged with that. So but we haven't got a huge amount of time. I want to romp on because there's some questions coming in.
All right. Yes.
Two other things that I'd really like to know. What are the things that you feel as a policymaker or as a policy designer that we're going to have to be ready to fight for in the coming year?
Yeah, in the coming 12 months, there's a few key targets I can think of right away. One is both next month and in the autumn budget, there will be announcements of a green stimulus, a stimulus package. Whether it'll be green or not is up in the air yet. But the goal for us, for those on the call and for everyone interested in this space, is to try and influence that. Write letters to your MPs or whatever action that you're able to take, willing to take, really communicating and urging those in power that this stimulus package that will be announced inevitably to kickstart the economy, it has to take the economy in a completely different direction. Insofar, it hasn't been great. If you look at global announcements so far, about $500 billion have already been allocated in some form to dirty industries. to industry that will continue to emit, and about $12 billion have been for the low carbon sector. So you can see the disparity already. And UK cannot go down in that direction. So that's one clear opportunity for the next sort of 6 months or so, trying to influence that. I can go into specifics, but yeah,
Well, it relates to the next question, which the cultural sector has got something called the Cultural Renewal Task Force that the government has set up. It's led by DCMS, various subgroups, which has been set up to create a recovery plan for the cultural sector, which has been so particularly and seriously hit by COVID-19. What would you say to that needs to be in the Cultural Renewal Task Force thinking now?
I mean, from an overarching sort of point of view, one thing we've been asking for all along is climate change has to be an across-department, across-Whitehall issue. So you can't leave aside DCMS, the Digital Culture, Media, Sport department, and say, oh, climate change has got nothing to do with you. Let's just deal with it in the Environment Department or the Business Department. It needs to be embedded across. So in that sense, the task force could perhaps come up with some ideas on how DCMS could lead a green recovery out of COVID. That's one thing I would say. The second is, if there is a lot of resources being bumped into the economy directed towards the cultural economy, which again is a backbone to the country as well. So how can you green that? I.e., how can you put potential conditions? I don't know what those conditions are precisely, but potential conditions on like this resource, this stimulus is incumbent or conditional on certain targets that these institutions might have to set up internally to reach net zero, or externally in terms of engagement with the public, things like that. So these are a couple of ideas I can think of, which the task force doesn't have to give detailed ideas, but even if you can get the right tone, right message at this point and embed that idea of green recovery in DCMS and other departments, we'll get ourselves on the right path, because right now they're not even considering these questions seriously.
And as Chaitanya, as you know, and we'll talk about this a bit later, Julie's Bicycle has actually written a letter to Oliver Dowden, Secretary of State for Culture, but copying in George Eustace from DEFRA, Alok Sharma, who's the COP26 president and business secretary, and the Department for Education, Gavin Williamson, can't remember. Anyway, we've copied those three ministers in. We've asked for exactly that, a recovery plan that really is about a green and just transition. We'll be launching it on Friday for everybody to take a look at, and if you'd like to endorse it, you'd be very welcome. We've had some questions come up, which I'd like to ask you. So first of all, until we can, this is a comment really, clearly describe the jobs that will emerge in the Green New Deal. It would be hard to enable workers to believe in a just transition. What work is happening with senior management teams in large carbon use companies to enable these discussions to start happening? And that's from Rebecca Valens. Thank you, Rebecca.
So there are sort of two questions there. I mean, the first one I understand is a comment, but it's an absolutely fair comment around jobs. I point you, I mean, to be honest, there's so many reports out there. Pretty much on a daily basis, I come across a report that says, here are some jobs that will be created during this transition. I think but that's what an economic model would spew out, saying input these numbers and you basically get a bunch of output there. It's less about, basically for think tanks like us to produce the evidence needed to make the policy decisions. So there's enough evidence out there, and I can assure you there's a lot of evidence out there saying there's hundreds and thousands of jobs that are potentially that can be created in these spaces. Just one I'll point out, which came out last week, that Vivid Economics, another economic consultancy, put out on electric vehicles, retrofitting our homes, making them warmer, all sorts of jobs created in these spaces, up to 300,000 jobs, if I remember the number correctly, right? So jobs are there to be created, but the question is they won't just be manifested out of thin air. they need investment and they need public investment. And that's where NEF and our advocacy, policy advocacy work comes in. We try and make this argument, compel ministers, compel Whitehall to take these decisions. The jobs will come. On the second question about high carbon sectors and senior management there, the conversation, as far as I understand, is definitely started, but there is inertia. When you've been doing something in a certain way for 3 decades, 4 decades, 5 decades, it's going to take some time for that inertia to sort of, unravel and you've sort of taken a direction. But whether you need a carrot or a stick to make that happen is a policy question. And that's where you come in. If it's the oil industry, I'm tempted to say you need the stick sometimes because they've known about this problem for a long time and they haven't done anything about it. And some sectors, you know what, they need the support and they need incentives. They need the carrots to be able to change their behavior. So it's a bit of both from a policy angle.
Great, thank you. And a question from Jenny Foster. Is NEF, New Economics Foundation, using the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, as a framework because they do embody intersectionality?
Yes, but perhaps not to the extent, or perhaps there is a UK contextualization of the SDGs. So we heavily focus on UK policy environment and a bit of Europe as well. And Sustainable Development Goals has a sort of a global framework to it. So there are certain aspects that we draw on that, like reducing inequality using the Gini coefficient is I think part of the Sustainable Development Goals objective aims. And we've got a similar goal within NEF to halve inequality by 2040, for instance. So we've got some goals that are built on the Sustainable Development Goals framework, but I'd argue that what we've worked on and developed is perhaps far more nuanced and specific to the UK context. Okay,
a couple of other questions. Thank you. Two questions from Julia. I'm not sure which Julia that is. With mass unemployment coming within many sectors, including hospitality, what mass re-employment opportunities are there within a Green Deal?
Great question. I can't speak to the hospitality sector that much, but it's close to my life in the sense that my in-laws, for example, run a guest house, part of the hospitality sector in Oxford. And it's been shut for the last 3 months. But obviously, the government has supported them, but they've built this over the last 15 years, and now it's just completely idle and quiet. And they are facing a hit, and it's not sure what's going to happen afterwards. 3 months from now, 5 months from now, she had to lay off a lot of her staff, furlough, but nonetheless, they are unemployed as well. So there is uncertainty there, but I'm not sure how we're going to come back in that space. But I'm going to bring you to this aviation report I was talking to earlier, and one of the examples that we offer one of the solutions we offer for the expected losses in the aviation sector, up to 70,000 jobs in the aviation. I didn't even know there were 70,000 jobs in the first place in the aviation sector, and that's the kind of loss we're talking about. And one solution we offer is the job retention scheme that the government has put forth. Change that into a job retraining scheme. So repurpose that to make sure that you actually retrain people and provide them the skills they need for the jobs. It's not easy. It's easy to write on paper. If someone has been doing a task or a job for 30 years and say, oh, we'll retrain you to be something else, it is very hard. I completely appreciate the challenge there, but we need those kind of solutions, and it's going to be tough. The transition is not going to be easy, but we need to make it as smooth as possible.
Great. And Julia Roebuck, sorry, Julia, I'm going to just state your question because I'm not sure we've got time to properly answer it. Sorry. It's now we see the true value of what really keeps the country going: key workers, volunteers, community. How do we use this in a new system to move beyond GDP as a measure of success? Julia, I think that's a great question. And I think we all feel the limitations, horrific limitations of GDP. Do you want to say anything quickly, Chaitanya, before we move?
Very quickly. Yeah, very quickly. Just go to NEF's website and type well-being budgets or alternatives to GDP or GDP. NEF has done a lot of work in this space, and it's just gaining traction again, which is good. So yeah, check out our website, and I'm happy to follow up with anyone. Just drop me a line. You'll find my address on the website. And
Chaitanya, just before we finish, a couple of things that make you happy, really briefly. Oh, caught me off guard there. I mean, not general things. I'm talking about where we are in the world, because it's pretty hard. So, are you optimistic? Are you, what gives you hope? So the phrase I used was cautiously optimistic, because again, we're at a crossroads. What we know is government intervention, if done right, they can have a significant impact in the way we live. Yes, a lot of people might not like it. This was in response to a virus. We might need a similar response to something that a lot of people will not see as a virus, but it's a long-term. We're seeing the impact, but it will get worse and worse over a period of time. And that's the challenge of communication, which is where your sector comes into play as well, communicating the urgency of the crisis, that this is, in some sense, COVID in slow motion, and that needs to be communicated. So cautiously optimistic, but it reminds us that we can do this. There's technology already. I hate to keep saying it all the time, and unfortunately, that's the crux of it. It comes down to political will, and I think we can get there. Terrific. Thank you so much, Chaitanya. I mentioned earlier, just before we conclude, I mentioned earlier that we've sent a letter. I'm really sorry that I forgot the name of the Department for Education Secretary of State, Gavin Williamson, apologies. But I just thought I'd romp through the asks, because they speak very much, not just to this conversation, but also to the cultural sector. We've been doing a lot of work looking at and mapping across these three key areas: net zero, just transition, and green, a framework for a Green Deal, to culture. And we've asked that the UK Cultural Renewal Task Force prioritise a rapid, just and green recovery with designated representation at every group, and a just transition woven into all themes to ensure that those who've been left out and the freelance creative workforce are taken fully into account. We also ask that the recommendation from the Committee on Climate Change that legally binding net zero policy is embedded across all levels and department of government is adopted by DCMS. And we put in place policies to meet the current 4th and 5th carbon budgets, which we're not on track to meet, that public cultural compliance and funding requirements are aligned to net zero requirements, and promote biodiversity, and that larger organisations adopt science-based net zero pathways. We do have templates for all of this, as some of you who've been involved in the Arts Council programme will know. A national green recovery plan is sector specific to include the creative and cultural sector, with a focus on inclusion, placemaking and communities, including strong incentives for spaces for nature. 5 specific R&D funds are designated to the creative and cultural community to benefit from interdisciplinary knowledge and partnerships, which result in fit for purpose and future-proofed cultural services and products. And finally, 6, a cross-cutting government task force on creative green skills and curriculum reform is created, with representation from all of these departments, encompassing environmental and cultural expertise to prepare the cultural workforce adequately. And that we will be releasing publicly on Friday. We have sent it in, but for anybody who'd like to endorse it, you'd be very welcome. And unpacking, as somebody has pointed out on the chat room, I think that was from Julia, what that really means is going to be a fascinating, very creative and a very intersectional task that we have before us. So thank you so much, Chaitanya. terrific. Farah's got a few words to say at the end, but also thank you everybody so much for attending. I hope you found it useful. Chaitanya, again, terrific. Really, really, really appreciate your time with us.
Not at all. You're welcome. And thank you for everyone who dialed in.
Thank you so much, Alison and Chaitanya. Before we go, we do have a few little things. So we've got a quick poll that we would like you to fill out, and it's just asking how the current COVID-19 pause has impacted you or your organization's commitment to creative climate action. So you should see that on your screens now. As that's going on, we'll just talk about the next steps. So you can keep the conversation going online using the hashtag Creative Climate Chat and the social media handles. So it's Julie's Bicycle, Chaitanya Kumar, and @NEF. You can sign up to our bulletin. So there'll be links in a slide in just a second. And the next 2 creative climate chats are booked in. So the first one next week is with Paul Dickinson from the Carbon Disclosure Project to discuss how we drive corporate climate action and the impact of COVID-19 on global climate ambitions. So that's at the same time next week. And the week after, we've got Raj Pal, who works on a brilliant project called Colonial Countryside, which is about uncovering the histories of land and artifacts and how it relates to our current understanding of the British countryside. So that's on Wednesday, the 24th of June. We're keeping the chat function open for the next 15 minutes. So if there are any things you would like to share between yourselves or any conversation that you would like to have, please stick around and you're very welcome to participate in that. So we'll collect all of the resources shared and send them around along with the recording in the next few days. And afterwards, we'll be sending around a really quick 4-question survey to help us to improve these sessions. So I'll just share the results of this poll. And it's quite split. We've got 38% of you who say that you're galvanized to do more. 38% of you who are already very active on creative climate action pre-COVID-19. 5% of you who are taking this moment to start thinking about it for the first time, which is a really important step. And 19% for whom any creative climate action has been paused. So it's really interesting to see those results, and we'll be taking that into how we think about our work at Julie's Bicycle too. So again, I would like to say a huge thank you to Alison and Chaitanya, and we'll be keeping the chat open from now on. Thank you.